Welcome to the Fishing Discoveries rundown of the Fishband GH100. And if you're new to BFS, or maybe the first contact you've had with that style of fishing with the blog article about it on our site, then this might be one of the places that you start, potentially one of the first reels you might be looking at. So I want to give you a brief rundown of what it's actually like, and then do some specs, and we'll get into fishing and doing some other sort of tests with it as well. But basically, the first impressions you get of it is it's obviously a low profile. It's very much in the style of the kind of the Shimano Aldebaran sort of look, and a lot of the low profile, modern, almost like space agey looking bait finesse reels that you get. Clearly and obviously, it comes with the shallow and ported out light spool. That's kind of very characteristic of this style of fishing. So it's designed to be sort of pretty BFS out of the box in many ways. Gear ratio is 7.2 to 1. So if you're used to like really small sized regular fixed spool spinning reels, it's a really sort of high rate of line recovery. Plus you get all the fun and games of sort of casting with a bait caster and that sort of the sensation and the fun of that as well. So it is looking to be an entry into that sort of style of fishing. Inside it, if we pop the side cover off, there's just a little latch there. This is where the magnetic brake settings are sort of controlled on that dial. Side plate inside that is, it's clearly, I think it's fairly common knowledge that it's very strongly inspired by the Shimano style of magnetic brakes, but in use, it's extremely effective, and it is surprising. Okay, you can tell that there is a sort of a plasticky feel to this, the chassis compared to some of the real high-end reels. But in terms of being able to dip your toe in the water and just give it a try without, investing hundreds and hundreds of dollars in a reel, it's a pretty good experience actually, and we'll certainly get into that. Just while I've got the side plate off, and John, tell me if you can get in sort of close on this, if I need to angle it over a little bit more. Right at the bottom of the well, at the deepest part of that sort of side plate, you should be able to see a little like orange rubber seal around a small circular bearing. That's my upgraded ceramic hybrid bearings that I've installed. The most basic upgrade that you can do, and we'll get into the reasons as to why you might want to do this, but one of the most basic upgrades that you can do is to simply change out the stock bearings that in the side plate, and then there's one that actually comes on the spool as well. So this one here, this is actually on a spare spool. This is the stock bearing that it comes with, and there's one, the original one in that side plate would have been of the same format as that. In fact, we've got them here. I'll put a link in the description as to the sizes, the internal, external diameters, whatever else for those. The ones that I actually bought for this reel, they're either 7 or 9 GB pounds, so not very much. It might have even been dollars, but basically you're looking around about $10 or less to upgrade the bearings. And one of the reasons you might want to do that is it gives you the ability to cast much lighter lures, because the inertia, actually getting that spool moving at the beginning of the cast is critical, so that both the weight of that spool and then the resistance to starting it spinning, that's the key really that helps to determine how light you can go. And again, I probably don't have time to go into, you don't need to just get into, casting as light a lure as possible just for the sake of it. There may be good fishing reasons to do that, but we can get into that in a separate video. I'd like to also show a lot more casting with this as well, and we can certainly look into that. But just to give a flavour of why you might want to change those bearings out, and I'll actually show you how to do that in this a little bit later on. The little bearing measuring tools that you can get, it tells you, when it sits on each of the internal sort of, the internal diameters basically sit on each one of those steps on the tool. So this is the factory issue stock bearing that comes with the reel that I actually took out of that reel. And can you get close in on that, John, just for a quick shot?
Keep it still.
How's that?
Got it.
Okay, so if I give that a good old spin, you should be able to. I've just striped the outer rim of that with some black marker pen.
Sideways a little bit more.
This way, aren't it?
Yeah, that's just 1 second.
Okay.
We can see that line then.
And giving it a good old, I'm giving it quite a good twang there. You can probably see the bearing tool just jumping up when I'm doing that. And that's possibly slightly unfair as a measure, because what happens is that when factories and manufacturers ship these bearings, they tend to want them as smooth and as quiet as possible, so they load them up with grease basically. So one of the tests we'll get into subsequently is actually cleaning that out and seeing what the performance you get with the cleaned up bearings, the degreased bearings. But just as a comparison, again, these are not super expensive. They're not even like BFS micro bearings. They're a ceramic and steel hybrid bearing. Again, I'll put the links in the description. But if I give that a similarly good twang with a thumb, you can see that you get a lot more spin time. And now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily tell you everything you need to know, because part of the reason a bearing might spin longer is if it's actually heavier and it has more kind of momentum and that kind of thing. But in this case, what it's giving at least an indication of is that it's a little bit easier to get that thing started and get it moving. And we'll get into how that translates to what the experience is on stream. So to get into some of the nitty-gritty of it, I've got my clearly this is quite interesting. If you ever order a set of these scales, it's 3 decimal place scales that are set to grams. The stuff that Amazon or wherever you buy it from starts to show you as a result, including like little Ziploc bags and that kind of thing. It kind of gives you a clue as to what most people buy these little microbalance scales for. This is the replacement spool. It's exactly the same as the spool that's in the reel. There's nothing different about it. It's not a lighter spool. And it comes with that factory fitted stock bearing as well. And the specs say that, when the information supplied to the reel say it's 9.3 grams. And on this scale here, which I've just calibrated, it's coming in at 9.343. And, when I've done it a few times, it's been 9.341 to 9.343. So it's definitely in that kind of 9.3 gram sort of ballpark. Taking the bearing and making sure I'm getting the same one that's actually on the spool there. If I put that stock bearing on there, that's a nudge over 1.5, so that's 1.506 grams. So roughly speaking, if you take the, trying to get an idea of the rotational mass of this spool without the bearing, you're looking at around a nudge over 7.8, I think that's 7.83-ish grams. And that takes you down potentially, depending on how everything else in the reel works, it brings you into that pretty low sort of sub 2 gram lure kind of territory. You might be able to get down close to that sort of 1 gramish territory, but that part of that depends on how well the brakes perform and how good you are at controlling the spool, just particularly at the start of that cast. But what I would say is that in use, it's probably its sweet spot is around about that kind of 1.8 plus. So and actually 2 grams, 2.5 grams, it's certainly getting very, very comfortable and very easy to cast for most people. So we've got the weight of the spool kind of dialed in there, and the weight of those bearings. One thing which I think is really useful and handy for most people that are sort of getting into this and wanting to do these small upgrades, very basic upgrades, is to actually have a look inside the reel and check out how to actually do that. So there's 1 or 2 ways you can go about this. You can either start delving and digging inside the bearing that sits within the side plate, which again it just snaps on and off as we sort of showed earlier on. Key point, when you are fishing, make sure that you close that so you don't accidentally knock it off by and drop it in the water. You don't want that braking system ending up full of crap from the river basically. But when you do want to open it, just knock it towards yourself, quarter twist like that, and then the whole thing comes out quite easily. Put that to one side because we don't need that for this operation. And if we start with the bearing that's actually in the side plate, you've got to be a little bit careful here because there is a retaining spring that sits inside the side plate. If you just kind of twang it off willy-nilly, you know, you might be on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass trying to find it. But basically, I'll try and show you as best I can, just if you can get really tight in on that, John. You might be able to see, if you look right in there, right at the base of the well inside the whole braking system, there is I can't count how many sides, but it's almost like a pentagonal sort of shaped wire spring. That's sitting within a little retaining channel, and that's what holds that bearing in place down at the bottom of that well. I've very kindly been lent a little rig tool, a hook from by John. I think he used this for his carp rigs and all sorts of things, baiting needles, whatever else. But basically any implement that's got a fairly fine point on it. And the idea is, I'll show you the idea first before I actually do it, but you slide it down and get it alongside one of the flat sides. And then, particularly if you can twist and then just lever it off. If you do that with your thumb over the end of the opening, it means that it can't spring out. So I'm going to have to kind of talk you through that as I do it. So hopefully if I get right in here. Okay, and just be, you know, fairly patient. It might take a little while twanging around. I just felt it ping against the underside of my thumb there. So it's a good job I had it covered up. That is the bad boy in question. So that's the retaining spring, and as I say, it just sits in a little channel just on the upper face of the bearing. Now, hopefully you can fish the bearing out fairly easily as well, and it should just pop out like that. So this, as you can see from the rubber, the orange seal, this is the upgraded bearing. But obviously the procedure is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're taking out or putting in the stock bearings or after you've cleaned them, or whether you're putting new ones in. And it's pretty damn obvious as well which of the two bearings goes in which slot, because the other ones just will not go in. So yeah, it's either rattling around, you know, because it's far too narrow, or you just can't physically fit it in. So it is pretty obvious. People have mentioned that they sometimes have problems getting some of the metal components past the magnets and things. So it might be worth having a tool that you can actually grip something with to push it past and get it into that sort of position that you want. But for this one, I think we should be able to just kind of pop that in fairly straightforwardly, and just get it to sit in the right orientation and drop down into the hole there. And you can see that it sits flush right at the bottom of that well through the braking system. Then it's the fun bit. We might have to do a time lapse on this, because getting it back in is a little bit more tricky than pinging it out. I tend to like to use something, as I said, to grip onto it with, and then sort of feed it down into that position. Try and get at least one part of it into the little gully before tamping it home. And it's just a case, again, of being a little bit patient with it. I expect the more experience you get with this, the better you get, and the faster it'll be each time you do it. Okay, so it's a bit of a wrestling match, but you ought to be able to see now that that is sat down quite nicely within that channel. And its only function is to just stop that flipping and flopping forwards out of the little recess at the end there. So that's the bearing in the side plate. For exchanging the bearing on the spool, you're going to want there's various specialist tools that you can use. This one's a fairly cheap one, but the key thing is that you don't want to be bending this pin. So it requires you to push in a perfectly straight line. So if you try to squeeze it with pliers, there's a decent chance that you might bend that pin, and then you'll struggle to get it back in again. You can buy, you can buy replacement pins, and it needn't be necessarily the end of the world if you do that. But this little tool, it just helps to reduce the chances that that'll happen. And it's a case of withdrawing it. And again, John, if you can get in super tight on the actual pin rather than the bearing there, you should be able to see that the end that is closest to my nail is narrower than the fat end. So you want to be pushing from the narrow end. You don't want to be driving from the fat end. So in that case, what you want to be doing is the pin that will screw down in this little tool towards that side, that wants to be towards the narrow end of it. So I'm just going to reposition that so I can actually see it. Can you see right down inside that recess where the two things are meeting together? And then it's a case of just turning gently like that. And it should push it and pop it out. And you can see that there's a little recess in the tool at the bottom just to take the pin when it comes out. Some of them will be much stiffer than others. The manufacturing tolerance on these things will be a bit different. The very, very high-end reels, very expensive, you'd expect to get higher manufacturing tolerances and greater accuracy and consistency. And that's just popped out there in the bottom of the bearing tool. Set that to one side. The only purpose for that pin is to hold that in place and to stop it coming off. It doesn't even, you'll notice it doesn't even hold it tightly up to it. It's just simply there as a kind of a fail-safe if that jumps too far in one direction. And the pin itself will sit into a little recess in the other side of that. And that's really all that there is to it. It is, there are more components. People get really into, and far above my engineering ability, they can strip these things down to the component parts, and you can get really into super tuning all different aspects of it. But a very quick and easy upgrade is switching out the bearings. But I'm also going to investigate what happens when you clean up the stock bearings on this particular reel. I'm really happy, really for the price point and the amount of fun that I've got out of this reel already. Just making that simple upgrade is really, really fantastic. So perhaps that might be a good spot. Clearly, it's very easy to reverse engineer how to put that back together. You twist the pin around, make sure it goes through, push it into place, make sure it's centralized, and then pop it back in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and join me on the next one.